Hello. So we're back for an early evening one this time, rather than being up so late in the night. So, last we spoke, we were working out some data and figuring out how to collect data from the game, look at it, tweak our algorithm. Now, this is free, but not terribly efficient, as you may have noticed, how we had to constantly rebuild things. And so there's some other tools that we'll look at in a minute or later on about how to address that. But so uh, one of the things, one of the reasons why we were able to get such a beautiful flight in the end, which I should have grabbed that graphic rather, I guess, but in any case, um, was that the data that we have about our current altitude. So our whole algorithm is based on um, the using the PID to maintain our altitude when we hover. That whole algorithm is based. We kind of brushed over it earlier, but the algorithm itself is based on what is referred to as control laws. Uh, so this is a sort of collection of different places where the term control law has been used, and primarily where we're dealing with it is in the control system background. These control laws are algorithms that determine the desired excitation, in our case, the amount of throttle, based on the error signal, the difference in our altitude, right? And they use 2 to 3 terms, one scaling the present value based on the error, that's the proportional term, another scaling it on the integral of the error, the integral term, which we don't typically use, and the third one, the derivative term, we are really only using the P and the D, and maybe that's where our algorithm has been difficult to tune, because by and large, it's the P and the I controllers that come first, rather than the P and the D controllers. In fact, if you have a term for all three, that's where you get the PID, right?
Right.
So, of course, depending on how you want to do the calculations, you have the possibility of, filtering out the noise of your signal means you might have a phase lag. In other words, if you have to take hundreds of samples or dozens of samples are coming in per second, as this typically would be, of your altitude. And you'd say, well, how would you measure your altitude? Well, there's a couple of ways. So we'll come back to this here in a second. We'll have a brief discussion about how do you find out what your actual altitude is, right? So here on the planet Earth, you could, for example, use GPS, and that gives you altitude, but it's not terribly accurate. It doesn't update very quickly. And when it is very accurate, is a rare case where the satellite is almost directly overhead. So what you would probably use if you're trying to land a lander like we do here is something like a radar altimeter. It's a radar gun um, pointed at the ground, essentially, right? And in this case, this is for a general aviation aircraft, so it's this little tiny black box, right? Specifically 3 inches by 3 inches by 6.8 inches. Um, and these are the specs, right? So this little radar piece of radar equipment's mounted under. Well, actually, I don't know. I can't really see the antenna. Anyway, these two little antennae are mounted on your aircraft uh, or spacecraft, and it uses radar, much like a radar gun, to determine your current altitude. And its accuracy is between negative 20 feet, which I guess would be above you, which is not a good thing um, when the ground is above you, to 2,500 feet, which is not very high up. And of course, the reason for this is it's fairly low power radar. You don't want to have humongous radars coming out from under these private planes, these little Cessnas. This is the kind of thing used on a Cessna. But the bigger aircraft use something similar, stronger power, and hopefully better accuracy. It's from between the ground and 100 feet, it can be off as much as 3 feet on the high end. It's less than or equal to 3% of the reading. If I'm understanding this correctly, they mean 3% of the reading. So at 2,500 feet, it's less than it's off by less than 5%. But 5% at 2,500 feet is 125 feet. So um, that's a bit much, right? For you to be trying to hover at some altitude like we're doing it at 5 kilometers off the ground. That's probably pretty high for anything along these lines. We should probably try and hover at, like, 60 feet or something. Well, anyway, somewhere under 2,500 feet. But you also notice it only gives us data 25 times a second. Whereas in the simulation that we're running as fast as the sim runs, which I'm probably somewhere in the 30 to 40 times a second range. So our calculation is updating faster than what you could really actually receive from this particular instrument. So, and also, there's some limits to, because there's 2 antennas on this thing. So the send and receive antennas. And so, of course, they can only tell you what's directly below if they're pointing downward. If you're rolling or you're pitching, well, then you're not going to get the right exact uh, distance to the ground. And then, of course, it can only read up to 2,500 feet, but it can only go up to 50,000 feet. After that, I guess it stops working somehow. Luckily, 50,000 feet is pretty much above any kind of aircraft that fly today. But you get into these 3 words: size, weight, and power, which in aerospace is SWAE. Because it got to throw the A in there so it spells something, right? It just can't be SWP. It's got to be SWAP.
Swap.
Swap. Because that's exactly what you're doing. You're swapping size versus weight versus the power requirements in everything in aerospace.
Right.
And then, of course, operating temperature is a necessity as well, right? So this device wouldn't do so well in, like, deep space, since it can't really deal with cold of the space, and it actually can't really deal with the heat of being in the sun in space either. So not an overall great device, but you could maybe wrap it in a lot of aluminum foil, right? As they tended to do in the space program. So this would be a radar altimeter. It works to some degree. It's a little rough numbers for what we're trying to do. We want something a good bit more accurate. So we're going to go over to something along the lines of a LiDAR solution. And the first LiDAR solution that you might look at is, speed gun, right?
Yeah.
So these speed guns figure out your speed by first figuring out how far away you are, and then a second later figuring out how close you've become. And based on that, they can figure out your speed. And so I thought it was interesting that it actually mentions the distance accuracy here of a 0.3 meters at 90 meters. Again, we're trying to be 5,000 meters up in the sky. Right. 90 meters, So in a real world hopper, like we're talking about doing, or lander, this, again, more trade-offs. This trade-off is going to be the accuracy of our sensors based versus the cost of them. Obviously, we could go to one of the big aerospace companies and say, give us a LiDAR rangefinder for altitudes up to 10,000 meters in the dead of cold of the moon. And they would come back with some ridiculously high-priced quote, right? But for all us not big aerospace companies, you might want to try and use something off the shelf like this, and as long as you don't turn it on until you're 90 meters to the ground, somehow figuring that out, of course, without having this altimeter. So in reality, you're going to use multiple altimeters of different types. One of the things that was noticed in, I think it was the first, or actually I guess it was the second video really, is how we were dropping through our own exhaust. And that exhaust might obscure something like a LiDAR. And then, so you might use the radar altimeter, and more importantly, you might do a bit of what's referred to as sensor fusion, where you take all of those disparate sources of altitude, and you bring them together through some fancy equations. One of which is, and I won't get too far into implementing this equation this episode because it would take a while, but It's actually referred to as a filter for your incoming data, right? You got noisy data coming in, your radar altimeter is off by this much, your LiDAR altimeter is off by this much, plus or minus, right? All those plus or minuses come together, and you can run them through this algorithm by one Rudolph E. Kalman. And how convenient! It's Emil Kalman. Yay,
Yay!
another Emil.
Another one.
Um, so the basic idea is that you don't really know where exactly your altitude is, right? Your altitude is somewhere in between the possible noise range of your one sensor and it's within the possible noise range of the other sensor. And depending on what altitude or mode or how much engine thrust you're firing at that given time, all of that may affect those ranges, right? But just because the data sheet says plus or minus 5%, that's fine until you're on some foreign planet, right? And the regolith of the moon, for example, has a different radar bounce back than the surface of the Earth. And then your radars get confused and you plop, right? And you go plop. Let's not go plop. So one of those algorithms is called the Kalman algorithm, and in some ways it looks very similar to the PID algorithm in that you're trying to take a one measurement and with some uncertainty and reduce it mathematically based off of another measurement and its greater certainty or additional certainty. For example, we've been talking about two instruments that are the altitude, right? Now, between this time where we sampled our altitude and the next time we sampled our altitude, both of those have some plus or minus to them, right? But at the same time, our inertial measurement unit was telling us that we had so much momentum and so much acceleration northward. And if we know our acceleration in some direction and we know our mass, we can figure out our change in velocity should have been thus much, and it was over this much time, and therefore our change in altitude should have been about yay. So using the inertial sensor and some mathematics, we can figure out what our change in altitude should have been between those 2 points. And of course, unfortunately, that is also with some uncertainty in your inertial sensor as to what degree of granularity you have for your inertial sensor. So all of these fuzzy if areas, of it might be somewhere in this cloud. That's kind of why they try and show this as like a little cloud. So this is a fuzzy cloud. There's one pixel in this cloud that's the actual measurement of your altitude. But it could be somewhere over here. It's a little higher. It's a little lower. And this is actually a two-dimensional view. It's from the two sensors. So rather than seeing, you end up sort of drawing a cloud, right? So one sensor is left to right, and the other sensor's error range is north to south, and that creates a sort of cloud of possible locations for your actual data. So this algorithm, and apparently there's some argument as to whether it was co-invented by somebody. Again, one of us, De Vries's, we co-invented some things early on. Hugo and Mendel and all like that. So in any case, basically the idea is there's an estimate of the output based off of some sensor. There's a measurement with some error from another sensor, and you can combine those into a more accurate final output that says that your value is probably very more likely in this point, in this area. So I don't know if it's a linear quadratic estimation. It doesn't look like it would be too difficult to implement. Let's scroll through all the theoretical and so on. We'll get back to that. That's all great for school, but we're getting things going. Here we got some formulas we can start looking at. So the Kalman filter assumes a true state at any time, k being some number of seconds after you took off, is evolved from the state of some number of seconds since you took off -1, the previous second, according to said formula. So x at this particular point in time equals these various other things at these various points in time. So f of k is the state transition model, which is okay, it's a little bit complicated still. So I don't want to get too far into the math and why we would do this, but suffice it to say, there's lots of code examples for this filter already in
Right.
existence. It's been around a while. In fact, it's not all that old, actually, because this kind of control logic and control capability wasn't truly really needed until the Apollo program. So to give you an idea, this is
1960.
the IMU of the Apollo program is that hunk of machinery. So that would tell you what angle you were at, right? So your inertial reference.
Go Eagles.
Yes, go Ingalls. So it gave you a accelerometer and gyroscopes. Now, oddly enough, this is all packed into this little tiny single circuit chip called MIMS, a MIMS chip,
Right.
and then they're on their phones, but they're not particularly accurate. That's why, don't pilot your spacecraft with a cell phone. Uh, perhaps. Um, but it's this kind of unit that would be used to get that inertial information to apply the inertial calculations off of your inertial information to apply a correction to your altitude information. And then you would further synthesize that in with the other altitude. So you might maybe combine the two altitude measurements in some fashion, either a Kalman filter or maybe just average. Not necessarily have to be that complicated with two measurements of the same data point. And then pass that through Kalman with information from your accelerometer. I think we can do all this in simple rockets too, but it's going to take a little bit longer than I originally thought. So, of course, much of what we're talking about is dealing with the noise in a real world system. Oh yeah, I missed one other thing. Here was a cool little view. This is a LiDAR sensor for multi-directional, right? So we play the video. So they're zooming in on the view of the data picked up by this LiDAR sensor. And this isn't just one direction LiDAR like the speed gun. It's a scan lines, right? And that draws the area around. And like they said, it's a point cloud, which is just a whole bunch of individual spots in space, in 3D space. And this is, of course, used for, self-driving-ish cars and all that kind of thing. But in a space application, this would be the kind of thing you would point down at the ground. Like, so there's all the individual lines, right?
Right.
And they have there's a view of a town. And they have three versions. They have this sort of downward angle, a gradient version where you get higher resolution near the center of your view and less resolution on the outer edges. And of course, a uniform one. So you might have something like this. I can imagine this sitting on your lander, and it's looking down at the ground trying to figure out where to land, right? And this has a whole lot better resolution, right? You've got your different scan lines, which are fairly low. 2048 doesn't seem like a lot of lines of resolution. But this precision of plus or minus 1.5 centimeter is freaking tiny. So this kind of LiDAR would be not the speed trap radar, which was plus or minus a foot.
Right.
Third of a meter ish. It's about a foot. This is down in the sub-centimeter range, which is really good for landing leg balance and all that kind of thing. But it also has a limit of 10 or 20 times a second that it can scan its whole view. So again, our simulator has all this extra time to do stuff, or all this more time to do stuff. Certainly more computing power. $6,000. Hey, not check. University price, $6,000. Hey, you pay the same. I guess. I don't know why they would be different. Maybe for research purposes, I guess. So same kind of thing here. Let's see. We got the points per second. Where's our size, weight, and power? Here's our weight. Roughly half a kilogram. That's around about a pound. Maybe. Not too bad. 14 to 20 watts. You gotta be kidding me. I think the whole limb on the Grumman, eventually Northrop Grumman, put together the landing module for the Apollo program, and I think it ran on like 20 watts or something. It wasn't much. So this one unit, 20 watts. And you wonder why we want nuclear power plants on the moon, right? Or on your spacecraft. So, anyway, these are the kind of devices that are out there that you would be bringing together into a lander solution. And so, 1.5 centimeters, that's not bad. 3%, that's pretty bad. Now, this one I think also doesn't have that big a distance view. Like, it doesn't scan that, well, I don't know. That seems like it would be pretty far away. I don't know. Is that 100 yards, 1,000, 100 meters? I don't know. From the sensor. So I don't know how far out this can go and still be accurate to 1.5 centimeters. So let's just kind of assume, because of all this, that we're going to basically put some noise into our altitude measurement. And let's get over to the game for all that. That's a bit of a long intro, but before we got to the game, let's get the sound on. So what we wanted to do is we want to introduce some. Let's get rid of that there. We wanted to introduce some noise into our signals, and then later we'll apply either the Kalman filter or some other logic to filter all that out. But first we have to have the noise to filter the noise, right? And for relative convenience, I just went ahead and put the entire program inside the orange black box and got rid of it out of the capsule because I was originally sending messages and it got confused. It got messed up. I don't know what happened, but the data came out in a bunch of weird binary instead of a text file. So I just put everything in the orange black box program. So, and there's our function right there. Add noise. So we're going to take some input, for in this case the actual altitude, by and large. Later on we can use this for other variables. But we're going to take the actual altitude measurement, and we're going to use a multiplier, and then return the altitude plus some random number between -1 and 1 times that multiplier. So what that means is that if the multiplier is 0, the output is the input, and we've had no effect, right? If the multiplier is 1, then we vary the input by 1 unit. So in the case of altitude, that'd be 1 meter, plus or minus 1 meter in altitude that we would be changing here. Now, I don't know if our algorithm can handle that, right? Because we're going to put this through the same PID algorithm, this hover PID, that we did before that gave us that nice smooth ride, So let's revisit that nice smooth ride first. So right now, here's the I created some variables so I could change this as I go at the different stages, because what I'm going to do here is simulate the fact that on takeoff we have the LiDAR, a high resolution LiDAR, 0.15 centimeter is the goal, right? Plus or minus. Right. Which in this case, that would mean the multiplier would be 0.015, right? And that would reduce the plus or minus 1 down into that range of plus or minus 1.5 centimeter. And then when we're at the altitude and we're trying to hover, we're going to have a radar altimeter. Ooh, horribly inaccurate, that thing. Especially at 5 kilometers off the ground. So it's going to come back with a much greater variable range, something on the order of, well, plus or minus 1 foot, right? So 1/3 of a meter. So that was the idea, so that I'll explain this top part in a second. But so our program on start, we set our target altitude to 5,000 feet. 5,000 meters, I keep forgetting. Meters, feet.
Different,
What's the difference? The difference between success and failure. That's what that is.
That's happened.
Yeah, that does not go well. So we're going to set the noisy. We're going to turn off the noise for this first flight. But you can see what I had to do was I can't do any of the wait and tells because I have to constantly update this noisy variable. So our noisy altitude is add noise to our current altitude times the multiplier. And then we have to constantly update that. Because the rest of our algorithm uses this noisy altimeter reading here in the hover pit algorithm. Noisy altimeter is what it's reading instead of the actual altimeter. So this first flight will leave everything the way it is, everything back to 0. So we've got 3 stages. Also on the descent, there would be a different amount of noisiness, right? We'd go back to the LiDAR for the descent. And it's actually, in reality, again, a little bit more detail in reality than the simulator. We actually couldn't kick on the LiDAR altimeter until, say, 90 meters, right? And above 90 meters, we would still have to use the radar altimeter, which is plus or minus a foot. Then, when we get below 90 meters, so we could add more logic to make it even yet more real. Will be good if we get done with making it noisy today.
Alright.
Because I want to show you how not just the actual noisiness, but then how to look at the data without having to graph it, and to get sort of a definitive measure of that noisiness. And then that measurement is called the standard deviation. And there's probably some other standard formulas for it, but the standard deviation is the easiest to apply. So we're going to do our first flight. Everybody's all nice and quiet. We got super sharp instruments. Everything's all nice and exact. And just to describe this top part, this is the new log. Instead of logging the altitude, the mass, and the thrust, I'm logging the noisy altitude, the actual altitude, and the thrust. And really, I'm only using the thrust to decide or to show when exactly I entered the hover mode and when exactly we dropped out of hover. That's what I'm using the thrust measurement, so I don't actually care how much the thrust is. And if you remember last time, we had to constantly do that, add it to the secondary axis thing. And that's because the thrust is in the 10 to the 5th realm, and the altitude is in the 10 to the 3rd realm. And in order for them to all be relatively easy to see and on the same scale, I'm just multiplying the thrust by 0.01. And that reduces its size so that it's in the same line with everybody else. And we skip a couple of steps in the chart, construction of the chart. So, having said all that long-winded stuff, we are going to head on out for our flight. Save it off, even though I'm sure it's pretty much the same one it's been. It's now the Hopper Noisy. I guess it should have been Noisy the Hopper, or the Noisy Hopper. Something like that. Whatever, we'll rename it later. So, as you remember, while we're taking off... Oh, I don't have that up. Well, while we start our flight, I will get the missing dialog box going here. Right. So this is the original jump up to 1.333 times the target altitude, right? That was where we last left it. So it's the same as ascent logic. Nice gentle ride, cruising along. And we're hovering. Now, we have this exactitude of the simulation going for us right now, right? So because of that, you'll see our acceleration is fairly stable, or we're still above 5,000. So once as we start to lower down and to get closer to 5,000 plus or minus 1, our acceleration goes nearly to 0. We're just barely firing, right? So what that means is that we're not jerking up and down, right? Because we're not firing heavy thrust and then reducing it. We've finally tuned into this nice, gentle amount of thrust, just enough to keep us in the air and compensate for the fact that we're losing mass as we burn fuel, right? So, but you can see it's a relatively smooth ride, is the point, as we sit here on the top of the elephant's back. And we fell off. Now we're riding down the elephant's tail. And that little kickover comes from some of this stability or instability, as we'll see later. You'll see here, for example, we're dropping through this cloud. So again, that's that question of um, dropping through our own exhaust. Is our LiDAR sensor going to be able to see through that exhaust, right? That's kind of the big question that you'd have to answer through some sort of testing. Now, of course, this is on a planet with an atmosphere, Drew, and you'll note that once you get down here, suddenly the exhaust always just stays below you. There's no exhaust plume on landing, in other words. Nice, relatively gentle landing, right? Everything going good. Whoop,
Whoop.
doop, and we're down.
And legs down.
So what that brought up, though, is another data log. Yay, new data log. So let's take a look at this data log here. We've gone through this a number of times. I'm just going to blast through it. You can pause if you want to see some of the details. Pretty much we're just importing a comma-separated values file into OpenOffice Calc. And we can throw in the chart. And this looks all super convenient and easy. And yeah, it is. If you only have to do it twice. If you have to do it dozens of times, it gets very repetitive. And smooth, and next. And skip the first row. And actually, I don't want to use first rows as labels because I'm going to move around in the data some. So instead, this name is going to be A1, or A2 rather, I should say. This is B2. This is C2. Again, you can see why I wouldn't want to have to do this over and over again for dozens. Okay, I did it already for dozens of flights. But you can see why I wouldn't want to do it over and over again for hundreds of flights. And you certainly can't, self-train a machine learning algorithm at this speed.
Not at your speed.
Not at this speed. You've got to find a way to be able to run the simulation over and over again. And mind you, okay, Simple Rockets isn't totally open source and allowing me to do that. I do believe there is a fuel mod, though, that gives me infinite fuel. And maybe there's a way in scripting to refill my tank. So I could launch, land, refill tanks, launch and land, and then it could collect data, and it would all be one flight, more importantly. And of course it's spewing out the data logs as it flies, right? So this is not particularly convenient, right? But it works and it's free. So the real world uses a different tool, and it is called MATLAB. And MATLAB is one of those highly complex data measurement tool sets. Complex, but not necessarily difficult to use. Actually, what he's showing here, over here, is this way of coding even more blocky than Visi, right? Yeah. Where you're literally, these are actually things like inverters and logic gates. And so, or what would be referred to electronically as an operational amplifier. So what he's basically trying to show here is there's some signal coming in, it's amplified, it's processed through some filter. That filter is combined with some other signals, right? So you can sort of draw out the logic of how you want to filter your signals. And you can drop down a list and click a button that says Kalman filter. And you don't have to write it from scratch. And so at the same time, you also have all these sort of strip charts, where the charts that we're seeing after the fact, you can see as each flight is going on, right? And there's several different strip charts with different ranges. This is a great tool. It's not inexpensive. And maybe there's an open source alternative, but I doubt it. So I got a 30-day trial. One of the goals, I think, for the next video is to try and tie in Simple Rockets to MATLAB. And I think a lot of people would enjoy having that little converter because there's a lot of the rocket geeks that want to be able to actually take measurements on
Right.
their things. So anyway, that's the more professional tool for doing what we've been doing here super manually. So first thing you notice about this is that the noisy altitude,
Whoop, whoop.
well, let's move her over here. So the first thing you notice is the thrust is much smaller than it was last time, right?
Yeah.
And that was that division or multiplication by 0.01, so that I didn't have to do this secondary axis maneuver. So, but really, we're just using this as a signal of when we turn on the thrust and when we turn off the thrust. We're not really analyzing the thrust here. We're really just looking at the altitude data, right? So we get a nice, relatively smooth, you know, um, elephant back here, right? And in the first 150 samples, we're sitting on the ground in the countdown, right? In this first little segment right here. So, say we wanted to look at that segment to kind of see visually how to compare them. In this, I have to go into data ranges and go to the data range, sheet 1. Oh, cancel. Do it over here, data ranges. Thought it was data series. Yeah, okay, here we go. So, say for example, you want to look at just the first 100 samples. You would have to change this. Can you even read that?
Well.
It's pretty small, ain't it? But you would have to change this to, in this case, 152. Alright. And we have to do that for the other ones. So the noisy altitude is that. The regular altitude is now only up to 152. And we might as well just get rid of the thrust for now. I could swear this was easier done all three at once. I don't know. Oh, I hate when that happens. There we go. Control Z, cut to the rescue. What?
B2, B2.
So, in any case, you get the idea. This is a royal pain to do any kind of serious analysis, right?
Yeah.
At least in the graphing side of it. And maybe there's some scripty way of doing this better that I'm just not familiar with. But there, you can see. Now you're looking at the value, but it's so steady, right? We're sitting on the ground. It should be a really steady altitude measurement, right? And of course, noisy altitude and regular altitude are the same. Of course, there's no thrust. But we're sitting here at roughly 7 meters off the ground, which is the reading when we're above ground level. I guess it's the height of the pod. So this doesn't really tell us anything, right? We can't really see anything. So what you really want to use is a way of looking at the data very quickly and easily that can give you some actual information about it. And as I mentioned before, that's called the standard deviation. In this program, it's referred to as STDEV. So we say this is going to equal to the standard deviation of everything in the noisy altitude, these, A3 to A14, right? 0. Big surprise. So a standard deviation of 0 means every single one of the values were exactly the same, right? And since we're sitting on the ground, that's not terribly a big surprise. Now, if we go to the first 140 values, you see we get a little bit of difference. So the first 140 values, they're all still on the ground, but they still differ by this much in the, how to describe this? It's a comparison of the sort of the average of the differences between the samples versus the average of all of the samples. So, in steady measurements, it's very close to zero. Because if you get the same number over and over again, there's no deviation from one sample to the next, and therefore you get a standard deviation of zero. Here you can see there is some, I don't know if it's an attempt to add noise to the program, or this is just the side effect of floating point calculations inside the Unity game engine deciding what your altitude is. This is pretty far down into the noise, literally. Right? And so we can probably land with, obviously we landed with that kind of accuracy. So now we were talking about adding about a centimeter and a half to the LiDAR, right? From takeoff. So let's head back over to the game. And orange black box. And so here, just before we start the countdown, if we make this 0.015, it'll pick a random number between -1 and 1 and multiply it by 0.15. And therefore we'll have a number between, I believe, it should be between -0.15 and positive 0.15, right?
Right.
And so we'll add just that little bit of noise, and then we'll run this just for the countdown, so that we get that first 140 samples.
Yeah.
So we'll head on out for that. And let's see. Let's see, was I off by an order of magnitude? I mean, always wondered about that.
See.
Yeah. 0.015, this is tens, hundreds. Yeah, that should be right. 1.5 centimeters.
Your page is still up.
Yeah, actually, I was just showing there's the new data file. Oh, I was going to stop it. Just okay, so the reason it was up was we were only really collecting for the countdown.
Oh.
We didn't need to actually take off because we're only looking at that first. There we are. It does this sometimes. It'll pop open this file, but the window will be minimized. Annoying. Again, more reasons to move to MATLAB, right? So here we have the noisy AGL, which is, you can already see, is different.
Yeah.
Right? But how different? So again, let's just standard deviation. Type the whole thing in. Of that. Let's just do it that way. Come back to the formula bar afterwards. To the first 140. So that's our noisy altitude is now 0.006 noisy. I'm sure there's a better way to put this. But in any case, and luckily we can just copy this formula over to this cell, right? And it'll do it for the next column over. So this is all for column A, and this is all for column B, but only the first 140 samples. So, as you can see, or 140-ish samples, as you can see, we've added quite a bit of noise. Because this number in scientific notation would be 1, 2, 3 decimal places over. So it would be 6.4 to the -3. And originally it was to the -6. So that's 3 orders of magnitude more noisy. And I believe, so when they talk about noise, they talk about it generally in decibels. Much like anything else audio. I'm not sure the conversion of that, though. I'd have to look that one up. But you can see we made our altitude quite a bit noisy, right? But only on the countdown. So let's go make it very noisy we'll make it noisy like that for takeoff and landing. and then we'll make it somewhat more noisy for the main flight, the hover portion of the stage. So 0.015 for takeoff when we have our nice clean line of sight with our laser altimeter, right? And that's the noise mark there. And then here is where we start our hover. And when we're hovering, we're going to be using that silly old radar altimeter that's only, plus or minus a foot, right? So plus or minus a foot is roughly plus or minus a third of a meter. Like I said, it was 0.3 meter, right? So now all of our calculations are going to be done with a 0.3 meter worth of noisiness, which is any given sample could be randomly off by that much. And we're going to maintain our hover. And then we're going to run back down to the surface. And as we run back down to the surface, we switch back on our laser altimeter. So we have 0.15 again. Right? Yeah, 0.15 up here. Oh, I guess I have the leading zero is throwing me off. So actually, you'll see here I have this other calculation, the PID out times some number. And so at one point I thought, well, I'm coming down out of the sky, I've got this engine on, it's putting out exhaust. If the engine has more thrust, it's got more vibration, it's got more possible plume interference. So I was basically going to tie the noisy multiplier to the amount of thrust we were using. To basically say, the more thrust you put out, the more noise you get in your signal for altitude. That may or may not be the case in a real world example, and you might have your nozzle. Our stuff's all tall and skinny, right? So you might have your altitude antennae or sensors out from the center of your craft, so that you're not getting that kind of interference from the thrust. So things are completely different on the moon with no atmosphere. The regolith blows away out of your way, but doesn't blow up into the air or float around because there's no air. And so it's probably, I'm pretty sure that Apollo used radar altimeters for the lander. That's when they're on the way down and they're reading out the numbers, 2.5 down, 6 ahead, whatever they were, I don't remember. But they were basically saying how fast they were moving forward, their lateral speed, and how fast they were going down. And I don't know if it was in meters per second or feet per second. Wouldn't surprise me if it were feet per second. So now we've got some noise, some real noise to play with. In fact, let's make this the noisiest possible. Let's make it a whole meter. So we're going to hover, but our exact altitude is off by a meter at any given point, plus or minus. That's pretty harsh. So I don't think we're going to have a nice smooth elephant back. What's your data prediction?
Oh.
You have no idea?
No.
Well, it's not going to be pretty. Not as pretty anyway. But we should still survive, and that's always the main thing. Survival. I keep saying I'm going to change the name, and I don't. And I keep looking on the other monitor. Alright. Go back to this view so we get a little more game footage. There it goes. And we'll be looking at those velocities again. And away we go. We're up. We're kind of wobbly. Just a little wobbly. Now, in this first stage where we take off and we're targeting a particular apoapsis, I'm just targeting the orbit apoapsis. So that's where I was saying we might have to add noise to other values.
No.
I wasn't looking at velocity, or altitude rather, for when to stop firing. I was looking at the orbit apoapsis, and if, of course, my altitude is off, well, then my calculation for my apoapsis would be off, right? Short of having any other knowledge of where I am in three-dimensional space. So here we go, trying to hover.
Yeah.
Coming back down to 5,000. Always a little rough as we slowly. Ooh, what's that? Oh, not good. So you can tell it's being a rougher ride, right? We're getting a
Doesn't
little.
like it.
And this is the problem with noisy data, right? So unlike the beauty of the flight sim, which by the way we have for general aviation,
Yes.
one of the other projects that we're part of. Oh, here we go. Time to fall out of the sky.
Oh,
It kind of kicked over just a little. That's why I left the thrust on just a touch. Just enough thrust to actually, get some angular control.
there comes the plume.
Yep, going through the plume, our laser. So again, I don't know how you would. Well, right now we're not actually turned on the. We have. Am I speaking today? Uh, so we haven't yet turned on the thrust at about 700. We do. You see, occasionally there's these little bursts of thrust as the calculation gets off in the weeds. But it quickly corrects itself, and come on now. This is not nearly as steady of a descent. Here we go. We've got our legs. Yay! Oh, we survived. That's always a good thing.
Wow,
But you
just
notice
at
the limit of fuel too, right? But you'll notice how we had such a harder time maintaining our 5,000 feet because our measurement was off, right? Seems pretty straightforward. So here's our latest data. And it's hiding again. There it is.
Because it's in use.
It says that, but it's that's why it was in use. It was just on the screen, on the other screen. So we can't actually do the standard deviation over the entire set of data because we were in several different stages of flight, right? So when we were sitting on the ground, there should be some variable amount to it, right? When we're going up in altitude, obviously the samples are changing, right? So the standard deviation is about how steady something is, really, not how rapidly it's changing. So that's why we can't really just run it over the entire data. But let's go ahead and take a look at the data again, see how our elephant looks now. I think he's going to have very ruffled feathers, our elephant, or what would be. He's going to have his cackles up. I think that's what he's going to look like. Let's see here. Insert the chart, and the chart wizard takes over. It's a line and point line and smooth lines. And the A2. A3. A2. B2. It's like a very boring version of bingo. C3. So, get all that in, get our bottom in place. Finish it off. Oh, there we go. Much different thrust management, right? So we've got all of this kind of wobbliness in our on our AGL, and like it looks like it's between, say, 700 sample 700 and sample 1400 is roughly this segment where we're trying desperately to stay in the air at the same altitude and our wobbly altitude, right? That's roughly sample 700 to 1400. So see if it'll behave this time. I say data ranges. Nope. Whatever, we'll do them separately. So, what I say, 700 to 1400? 700, 1400. And the same thing with the thrust. Well, if anything else, if nothing else, you get some tutorials on OpenOffice. So there's the entire time we're trying to hover. Sorry about that. So that's the entire time we're trying to hover, and that is a time when we're trying to maintain a steady altitude, right? Sample 700 to 1400. So that's the area that we want to do a standard deviation on. That's where we had the most possible change, right? So let's take a look at our noisy altitude between 700 and 1400 samples, which is roughly 10 samples a second. Or I think it's supposed to be 10 samples a second. I'm not sure what it actually amounted to. Let's see. So we want the standard deviation of our noisy altitude. Yes, fix it for me. And we want it from a 700 to a 1400. Ouch. Ouch. That means it was super unstable. Upwards of 16 meters. Mind you, it's at 5,000 meters. So is 16 meters all that important, plus or minus? Maybe not. But it does burn a lot more fuel when you have that unsteady data. Right? Our fuel picture is... our fuel picture is much more utilization. Right? In these previous times, this was pretty much just almost a straight line.
Yeah.
Right? Because we were just gently burning fuel, a little less fuel as we burnt a little more mass. So here, it's this horrendous. Let's go ahead and copy this over and put it on our other altitude AGO. Oh, not what I meant to do. I meant to copy this cell over here. Well, that's about what I'd expect then. Right? So, we managed to hover sort of plus or minus, well, it's not exactly plus or minus 16, but in any case, our stability is only slightly better in the actual altitude than it is in the noisy altitude, and that's because we were using the noisy altitude to maintain our actual altitude, right? So our actual altitude was just as unsteady as the noisy altitude. The result was just as unsteady, not surprisingly. So this is, I think, pretty much covers the majority of what I was wanting to get into today.
Alright, well, you're right at 1 hour.
Yeah, that seems about right. Hopefully, I don't know if we'll... I think probably I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to try and connect Simple Rockets to MATLAB, and that'd be pretty cool. So that we would actually maybe get like a little line chart of our altitude and everything across the game as we're flying. That would be... I don't know if, how complicated that's going to be. So, we'll see. I've only got a 30-day trial, but I can come up pretty fast on these kinds of things. So,
yeah.
And I used MATLAB for years, years ago, and it's a completely different tool now, really. Let me get my chat count in there. My credit for chatting.
Don't forget to blah blah.
Oh yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe and follow and all those things on all our platforms. You can check us out at eunumpluribus.com We have the links to TinkerCAD and Thingiverse and all sorts of things. So, and obviously you can message me on what's this thing called? Steam.
No, it's Twitch.
Steam, Twitch, YouTube messages. We're all over the place.
Everywhere. You
Yeah.
can get us anywhere.
So I hope if you enjoyed it, hope it was informative, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Take it button. Yay! We just did a heat. Ah!